Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the New America Foundation. For those of you, this is your first time joining us, the New America Foundation is a nonpartisan public policy institute that invests in new thinkers and new ideas to address today's toughest social, economic, and political challenges. I am Jamie Zimmerman, and I direct the Global Assets Project here at New America. In a nutshell, the Global Assets Project is a program that's focused on expanding access to effective financial services and wealth-building opportunities for the world's poor and marginalized populations. So it's good to see you all here today. I hope you're enjoying your lunches. Today's event, Transforming Intentions into Behaviors, is all about applying a behavioral economics lens to the issue of financial capability. And we have a really excellent panel and speakers lined up for everyone today and to explore this issue together, including a keynote from Dean Karlan on his new book, the presentation of our latest policy brief within the Global Assets Project, Accelerating Financial Capability Among Youth, followed by a panel of expert commentators to tell us what they think about all this and debate together kind of all of the above. Before we jump in, just a little bit of background for everyone. The paper that we're releasing today was inspired by and through the work of our YouthSave project. YouthSave is a 5-year multi-country research project supported by the MasterCard Foundation that aims to test the impact of savings accounts for low-income youth in Colombia, Ghana, Kenya, and Nepal. YouthSave is a consortium initiative led by Save the Children, but also with the Center for Social Development at Washington University in St. Louis, the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor, and of course the New America Foundation. Over this last year, this first year of YouthSave, we've been exploring together potential financial capability interventions for our 4 sites. Yet even among our broad consortium, we have really widely varying views and definitions of what financial capability even means, and more specifically, how to get there. So within New America Foundation, we started looking at the evidence and wondering why, really, with so many financial capability interventions in place around the world, are we seeing such a disparity between kind of the knowledge and skills development that we are trying to impart on youth and adults, and the positive behaviors that you would expect to see. So we devoted the last several months to exploring what we refer to as this kind of last mile problem, essentially the gap, filling the gap between good intentions, the intent to save, the intent to engage in smart financial behaviors, and actually doing so. So my colleague Payal will later explore our thinking in more detail, and then we'll discuss it on the panel. But for this paper, this field of kind of newish field, new for some, of behavioral economics provided the foundation for our thinking and for some of our ideas and our findings. And the great path-breaking work of several prominent behavioral economists featured prominently in our paper. And one scholar in particular stood out for us as a foundation for our work and what we were doing. There are very few behavioral economists that actually have tested these nudges in the field of microfinance and in particularly savings. And one scholar in particular, Dean Karlan, was really an inspiration for us for this paper. Dean is a professor of economics at Yale University and president and founder of Innovations for Poverty Action, a nonprofit that designs and evaluates programs for the world's poor. Dean is the recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award, the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and the Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship. Much of his work uses behavioral economics insights and approaches to examine economic and policy issues relevant to developing countries. And of course, he is the co-author with Jacob Appel of the new book, More Than Good Intentions. This highly readable and extremely thought-provoking book that he is here to discuss with us today. So Dean, thank you for being here, and I will turn the floor over to you now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Jamie, for the flattering introduction. So I'm actually going to deviate from a kind of normal book talk a bit, given the focus of the conversation on on youth savings. I will just give you a little bit of a brief statement about kind of the spirit of the book and the audience and the voice of the book. But really, I just wanted to talk more about evaluation in general and how it can help how it can help us guide us in policies when it comes to savings behavior. And so that's going to be the heart of more of what I'm going to talk about is on the youth savings side, given the overall topic. And there's actually nothing in the book on youth savings for point in cases because all the evaluations that I'm aware of that are using randomized trials are still underway right now on youth savings. So there's a lot that are being done. And so we can talk about some of those at the end. The book, in a sense, is really an attempt to introduce the world of saying that there's this huge debate that's happened over the past 10, 20, 30 years that usually stays very far back from the field. And very far back from the field in the sense that it's using like cross-country type analysis. And usually the two people that we see as the pillars of that debate are Jeffrey Sachs and Bill Easterly, saying, here's the list of things that work, let's just power money into it, versus everything's wasted and it's being thrown away. And the one thrust of the book is to say, well, say something that's just so shockingly reasonable that you can't possibly argue with this. And in fact, no one I've ever heard does, which is to say, well, some aid works and some doesn't. And yet somehow that message has eluded us or eluded this debate. And it's kind of shocking in a sense because you can't, I mean, it's just on its face, you just can't argue with something so mediocre in its claims and humble. But the reality is that what the book is about is trying to introduce to people who are either unfamiliar or on the outer edge of development this way of thinking, of saying, no, we can actually go to the ground, set up very careful field tests, and establish in particular settings what works and what does not. And the key from a research perspective is getting at the why. And that's more of what I'm going to talk about here. That's not what the book is about. The book is not trying to be a thesis of development in that sense. It is more of an introduction and some very specific examples that are key lessons that we have learned in certain domains. One of the other themes of the book is behavioral economics. And it's not, it is definitely, I think, the old adage of just because you have a hammer doesn't make everything a nail is very appropriate for behavioral economics. Now, I talk a lot about it because I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn. But there's also a lot of situations where just good old-fashioned economics can do us a lot of good. And the key is figuring out what to apply where. Now, so on to this talk. So there's three basic points that I'm going to try to, hopefully will make. The first is that when we want to think about how research can help policy, we need to think small and think big at the same time. And what I mean by that is fairly simple in an abstract way. By think small, what I mean is that a lot of times if we can unravel the box a little, get inside the box and tease out specific mechanisms of what's happening, then we can learn a lot more than trying to ask the big question of, here's a big intervention, does it work? And if you try to answer that big question of, here's a big thing that's doing 17 things and does it work? Yes, you could answer that. You could set up a careful test that has a control group and doesn't, and you can answer that question, but you're not going to be as powerful as you'd like to be for going into another setting and having advice as to what to do. So that's a situation where we want to think small. So as an example, think about interest rates. Just one component of a loan. There's many things that go into a microcredit that make it work or not. Interest rates is one of them. What is the sensitivity of borrowers to interest rates? And specifically, how are different types of people sensitive to interest rates? And what is that going to imply if we change our interest rates as a bank for the type of client we're going to bring in? Right? This is just a very small question. It's not answering the big question of does microcredit work? But once we understand something more about whether people are sensitive to interest rates or not, it can have huge implications for policy. And the same question could be posed on the savings side. Now, the think big part comes from recognizing that if we were to go and do a study of interest rates in one place, in one country, in one point in time with one organization, then everyone should be calling out and saying, well, wait a second, are you trying to tell me that that's the universal answer to interest rates, that you just tested them in this one place, one country, one organization, one point in time, and boom, the number's 17, right? That's crazy. So the key there is thinking big, recognizing that some questions need to be answered in a multitude of settings, multitude of contexts, not replication for the sake of replication, but theory-guided replication. So we can understand, okay, in settings where there's lots of competition, this is what we're going to expect. In areas where it's rural versus urban, this is what we're going to expect. In areas with this level of financial literacy, this is what we might expect. And that's getting inside the box and having some sort of theory as to why something works. And that's key. That's key to the kind of thinking big part, to how evaluation can help guide us in practice. Okay, so points 2 and 3 open up the same way. How am I doing?
You're fine.
Okay. So point 3 will take the longest, so I'm going to leave the most time for it. So point 2 and 3 both fit under the category of avoiding hyperbole. So avoiding hyperbole part 1 has to do with humbleness. The thing that I'm always struck the most by in the space of development is people who know stuff. I don't know much at all. And I'm always struck by how I got into this business of doing research because I didn't know a single thing. And I looked around me and I wasn't convinced, and I didn't see evidence that seemed to answer the questions that people were saying they posed. So, and actually, the story of how I got into this, which I talk about a little bit in the book, goes back to 1992. I was in El Salvador. I was taking a year off from life, sort of, supposedly, to, I was heading off to get an MBA, and I was taking a year off to go travel for a nonprofit, doing some good for the year. I didn't want to just backpack, so my best friend and I kind of hooked up with a micro-lending organization in El Salvador. And we were designing software systems for them, because that's what they needed, and we could do it. But at evening, I was really struck by the question of what this organization was doing. This is pre-internet. So all I had to go on when I went down to El Salvador was a brochure about micro-lending. I'd just done 2 years of investment banking. It kind of had a lure to me. It sounded good. It sounded right. I was a poli-sci major. I was not an economics major. So at evening, I asked them, where's your, the interest rates here were a little bit higher than I expected. I wasn't quite thinking they were going to be 72% when I kind of signed on for this back home. That wasn't in the brochure. Now, I worked out on my little Excel spreadsheet how 72% could actually make a lot of sense, and an individual entrepreneur with a very simple story of having fewer days of travel to buy stock for their sales can make 72% returns. So I wasn't having a hard time thinking about, like, okay, it's higher than I expected, but I can still see how your return on capital could be even higher. But I was still a little bit struck by, like, whether everybody was fitting that canonical story or not, or what was really happening here. And so, I asked the obvious question of do you have any impact studies? And they showed me their survey, which was fully satisfying to them, to their donors, and was state of the art in the industry of microcredit, as I since learned as I started looking more into it and looking at what their peers were doing. And it consisted of asking their clients, are you eating better than you were 2 years ago? Are you healthier than you were 2 years ago? Is your business bigger than it was 2 years ago? Okay, so the striking thing here, hopefully to many, is to recognize that there's selection bias here. And it's not just about the type of person who borrows, but it's also just about macroeconomic conditions, road conditions, other services from NGOs, things like this. Suppose they put onto this form, are you older than you were 2 years ago too? Right? Would we now be sitting here and claiming that microcredit caused aging? Right? Just for the record, if David's in the room, that line is totally stolen from David Rudman. No, we wouldn't, right? And so, and we wouldn't, and but for some reason we find that funny, but we don't find the first part funny, right? Well, we should find that first part just as funny as the second part. And that's the whole point of having when we talk about measuring impact, we have to answer the following question. How have the lives changed of people in a program compared to how their lives would have changed had the program not existed? There has to be some attempt to answer that second part of the question. And that's the motivation for doing randomized trials. So suppose in this setting they went off and they had a bunch of non-borrowers also answer these same questions. Are you eating better? Are you healthier? Is your business bigger? Are you older? Okay, and so the non-borrowers, Maybe they're not eating better, they're not healthier, their business is bigger, but they got older, right? So we can rule that out now. We now know microcredit didn't cause aging because we had a nice comparison group. But we have these other things that our borrowers are doing much better on. Do we still now conclude that we had an impact? And there the problem has to go, we have to think about who we're claiming to be reaching when we're talking about microcredit. Again, now I go back to the brochures that we saw when I signed on for microcredit the first time I signed on. And they all talked about entrepreneurial spirit, hardworking individuals fighting their way out of poverty. Well, take a room full of people who are entrepreneurial, hardworking, fighting their way out of poverty, and what do you think is going to happen to them over time? They're going to do better. That is the nature of, well, that's what that means in some sense. That's the obvious implication. So these are the types of issues which cry out for a randomized trial. And that's the motivation behind using this type of approach to do evaluation. So, so the key there, and the results that have come out of the microcredit studies in some sense have been very frustrating for me on a personal level. They've shown good impacts, but they've not shown the amazing, amazing silver bullet success that many have claimed. And so, I think one newspaper article that we wrote that they put the headline on, which was perfect, and so it is something like, microcredit works, but it's not the Hollywood ending. And somehow this has been disappointing to many, but it shouldn't. It is what it is. And it's something that has created some benefits for many people in the world, but it is just not seen. It is not. There's not evidence that it should be the main pillar in our fight against poverty. So avoiding hyperbole, getting evidence that includes a measure of the counterfactual is the first punchline. And I think this does actually apply to youth savings. Right? I'm a little bit nervous, to be perfectly blunt, about the hyperbole that I see happening in the youth savings market. And I'm nervous just because I would hate to see studies come out that show benefits but not saving the world, and all of a sudden that we have the same pendulum swing that we're seeing in microcredit, where all of a sudden people see these as a negative thing when they're not. It just says that it's not the only thing that should be done, and it's not immediately going to transform people's lives. And I do get nervous whenever you see too much enthusiasm. I mean, it's the nature of the beast. I understand that, and it's the nature of how things happen. Okay, second part of avoiding hyperbole is the application of theory. And a lot of times the application of theory it can be helpful for helping to tease out not just why there's so much hyperbole, but kind of some of the downside risks that we might be facing if we thought a little bit more theoretically about a problem. So let me apply this now to more savings-oriented things. So it's about youth savings. So when I was 20, 22, 25, all the way up till 28, I wasn't saving. I was borrowing. Right? When you take economics, you learn about the life cycle hypothesis. This is kind of a bread and butter model of economics that says when you're young, you borrow. And then when you get to the Middle Ages, then you start saving. You first pay down your debt, preferably, before you save, unless your debt is really, really, really cheap and you can actually have a higher return on your savings. But putting that aside, you pay down your debt first, then you save, and then when you're old and feeble, then you unsave, and you die broke. That's the goal, right? I've always told my mother that's my goal for her to die with not a penny to her name, preferably a little bit more too, like negative if she could pull it off, but not too negative, But this is the goal. So the first, when I first started hearing about youth savings, I had a little bit of hesitation because I was thinking, well, wait a second, life cycle hypothesis here, shouldn't we be having them maybe borrow to pay for schooling and things like this? There are other answers, and it does have to do with emergency, and it has to do with short-term needs. And I think the other key thing is it has to do with long-term behavior change. And so there might be an element where the life cycle hypothesis might be a theory, but it might not be the actual first best implementable strategy, and that there are teachable moments. And I think that's a large part of what the youth saving movement is trying to say in a lot of the context I hear, which is there's a teachable moment when you're young, and that's the way you set a lifetime of good financial behavior. And even if the optimal strategy, if you could sit down with someone and really work out the math, would be to say borrow, then save, then borrow, or dissave. Realistically, you got to teach them a moment when they're young to set up a lifetime habit, and you might as well do that even if it's not optimal. If that's the case, I think it has a different implication for the types of things you would want to teach. And that's why I see that as an important lesson, that it shouldn't just always be savings, but that it might be about teaching people how to choose the right product at the right time in their life and for the right purpose. So, in that spirit in particular, I think about the combination of debt and savings. And one of the things that we see a lot is people who are in high interest rate debt being encouraged to save. Now, we all, when we manage our finances, I hope, I can't swear for everyone in the room, but if you had debt, if you were borrowing at 18% on your credit card, I'm hoping you're not putting money into a savings account. I'm hoping that you're using any savings you've managed to accumulate at the end of a month, and you're using it to pay down your debt faster, right? And we might, in these types of simple lessons, should probably be incorporated into our thinking when we're dealing with savings policy around the world. So this is another way of saying that, and one could, in a very simplistic way, paying down debt is saving. So I'm not saying that is a form of savings, but we do often think about savings as money held in a savings account, whereas for someone who's in high interest rate debt, the smart saving for them is to pay down their debt faster. So that's the first point. I was going to give you 3 examples about kind of the theory side of needing to kind of think a little bit critically about what exactly is it that we're doing and why are we doing this, and that should help form specific prescriptions. The second is a series of studies that we did, and it's just an example it's an example of a nudge, to use the title from the way you've been talking about this work. And it's a series of experiments we did on reminders to save. Simply explained, in 3 different countries, we did text messages in 2 and letters in 1 to remind people to save. They all had a goal, and we reminded them about the fact that they signed up for a program, saving for a goal. In the instances where we reminded them of the goal, it worked even better. Now, if we understood more, and we're doing more tests on this, one key question we want to know is, why is it that people don't save? Is it about task management the day of making a savings, or is it about really their attention to a future need, a future expense? Because it has very different implications for how one would do messaging. Similarly, in the United States, the last thing I would ever suggest is that we send out text messages once a month to people to remind them to save. In the United States, you can do automatic withdrawal from your paycheck, if you have a paycheck, into a savings account. So there, in the United States, I want to send people messages to remind them to sign up for automatic withdrawal. And then I want to send them never a message again. I want them to just forget that that's happening, because God forbid they come in and change it, right? And so it's not as simple as just saying send messages, right? We have to have some understanding as to the theory as to what's going on that's making us say this is a good thing. Is it about failure to remember all the future expenses that they're going to have? Is it about day-to-day task management? As a flip side on the task management, we did a text message to remind people to pay their debts in the Philippines. We don't have this written up yet, but the preliminary results are finding that text messages the day of the loan payment were much more effective than the day before or 2 days before. Okay, so what is that? That tells us there's something about task management. It's something about that day. Remembering, oh yeah, I said I'd do that today. And if it comes the day before, 2 days before, good luck. Right? It's the same reason why when I left home 2 nights ago, where I was going to New York, leaving early in the morning at 5:30, and I had to take my oral typhoid pill, I'm doing the 8-day, every other day thing. Right? But I knew enough, I didn't just, I knew that I wouldn't, even the day before, what did I do? I left a note for myself by the front door right at the lock so that I couldn't get out the door without seeing my note to myself, give typhoid, to me and my 2 kids. Right? So it's a perfect example of just knowing enough about your day-to-day routine that you have to get the reminder at exactly the right moment, and you can't remind someone the day before. Okay. The third is on cash management. Where is savings going to come from? Right? So it's one thing to say, save more. Well, okay. We got 4 choices here. And once we think through those 4 choices, it has a very different implication for how you're going to do a program. You could save less somewhere else. Not so exciting in many cases. I mean, if we're just moving money from one pocket to another, maybe it's safer, maybe it's higher return, in which case, great. Maybe it's not, in which case, who cares? Okay, so that's one option. Option 2, borrow more. That could be really bad. Okay, if you're saving, but as a result of that, you find yourself in moneylender debt to do something else because you're holding money in savings, this actually could be a bad thing. 3, consume less. This is probably where we want to be thinking. That when we're thinking about saving more, what we're potentially really saying is spend less on temptation items. Okay, we're going to come back to that one in a second. And 4th, make more money. Okay, so as in you saved, it got invested. You know, think a retail business, a buy-sell store, right? So you save up a little, that allows you to earn more profits. Then that generates more savings, and that's where your savings is coming from. It's from a return on investment. So that's obviously a good thing. And that's wonderful when that happens. But a lot of times when we're talking about savings, that's not what's happening. It's not getting invested in some sort of working capital type story. So we really need to focus on the first 3. Okay, so my point is, why is it that all of the stuff that I see that is promoting savings, including some of my own, focuses on just the act of saving more without paying attention to where that money is going to come from? And it could very well be that what we want to focus our effort on is helping people learn how to reduce the consumption and identify those tempting moments in which money gets flittered away and figure out how to help them in that moment not flitter the money away so that the money doesn't get spent. So one of my biggest concerns, frankly, over the mobile banking movement is that this is lowering the cost of withdrawal in many cases to 0, or at least seems to be where we're going. The minute I can buy a cigarette by sending a text message is a minute that I, have that's a problem, right? You want that, you don't want a cigarette to actually cost 2 cents and be readily available at every whim, right? You want there to be some cost of actually withdrawing money for temptation goods. And there's other things that I think we can think about that are on that consumption side where that's the intervention that we actually really want to focus on, is helping people think through what their consumption is in a given month and where could they realistically cut back in order to save up for something in the long run that even they themselves say they want. And this is where we get into the nudge for good world. So nudge for good is nudges are not necessarily good, right? By definition, if you go, I didn't know this until a little bit ago, and I went back, and nudge by definition, the way Dick Thaler at least defined it, is not necessarily something that's good or bad. It's just the point just being that the way you frame choices and the way you set up a process for someone will influence the choices they make. And so with great power comes great responsibility, to quote the famous philosopher Spider-Man's uncle. Isn't that, what's his name? Ben, Uncle Ben, thank you. And so that's the spirit of nudge for good, is recognizing that with great power in how we set up these processes, we also do have some responsibility. And so, there's many examples that we can give of, quote, nudges that lead to potentially bad things. Just look at attempts to sell credit, for instance. There's many attempts to sell. Here's a favorite example that I was given the other day of one that is an example of a nudge for, well, I hesitate to say nudge for bad, but if there's one that we're going to call it, then this would be it. It was a payday lender in America that when people would come and repay their loans, the lender would say to them, "Oh, thanks for bringing in the money, but why don't you just keep it? Walmart's across the street. Why don't you buy your kids some Christmas presents?" Right, and it's just a simple way for them to issue more loans. Here's someone who is willing to pay the loan back, happy to, so it's a good credit. It's a brilliant move from their perspective to sell more credit and to encourage temptation goods by saying, you know what, let's just refinance your loan right here and now. You don't even need to finish paying it off. We'll just top you back up. Here's your money back. Go across the street. Enjoy yourself. Right? So, whether this is good or bad, we have to get into a kind of a paternalistic state. So I'm a little hesitant to do that, but it's certainly not in the space of what we would call nudge for good. I think we can agree on that. And yet it is, clearly a nudge in the sense that they are making it readily available and salient to someone that they have these other choices of these consumption goods that are there and ready to be purchased. So as we're designing programs, we need to think harder about what is it that people really do say they want when we're designing nudges, and how do we want to choose between their kind of current self and their future self, right? Because either, depending on who we are nudging for, it might have a very different answer. And so, and there aren't simple answers to these things, right? And going back to the kind of the simultaneous debt and savings concern that I've always had, just getting someone to save more might not actually be good for them. If they're in high interest rate debt, the best thing for them is often to pay down that debt faster. And so we need to kind of think about the full portfolio when we're forming policies and forming products and teaching and trying to teach people how to engage in better financial decision making for the household. So that's it. Am I good timing? Okay. Well, you're about to hold the "you must stop now." Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dean. We will definitely have time for the audience to ask Dean some questions a little bit later. Before we do that, however, we have one more short presentation for you, and that is coming from our colleague Payal Pathak. She's going to present to everyone the paper that we just released today, Accelerating Financial Capability Among Youth. It is available outside. Oh, and that reminds me, I should also tell you that the book, More Than Good Intentions, is also available for sale outside, limited quantity, so get it while supplies last. So just quickly, Payal Pathak is a program associate with the Global Assets Project here at New America, and she manages the project's efforts for our Youth Save initiative. And as mentioned earlier, she is the lead author on this paper that we're releasing today, Accelerating Financial Capability Among Youth, Nudging New Thinking. So Payal, if you could come up and tell us a little bit more about the paper. Thanks.
This podium's kind of high, or I'm kind of short. Thank you all for joining us today, and Dean, thank you very much for your illuminating keynote. It's a perfect segue into the topic of our paper, as Jamie mentioned. So for the Global Assets Project, the research presented in More Than Good Intentions and current lessons from behavioral economics has important implications for how we at the Global Assets Project approach efforts to spur asset accumulation among low-income populations, especially youth. So one of our projects, as Jamie mentioned, is Youth Save. And for us, lessons from behavioral economics has led us to think about how various psychological barriers to establishing sound financial behaviors, such as saving, can impede financial capability among low-income populations like youth. So when we started writing this paper, there were three major considerations that motivated our thinking. The first was born out of this emerging discussion on financial capability for youth and its implications for long-term financial stability and well-being. The current literature on financial capability basically states that for an individual to be financially capable, they require access to financial services like youth savings products, along with the ability through knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors to make sound personal financial decisions. So what does that mean? Basically, the assumption there is that access plus education leads to financial decision-making, like saving. But what we're arguing in our paper is that that transforming intentions into savings behaviors may not necessarily be accomplished just by these two components. So we see this in our everyday lives. Not to provide too much of a simplistic example, but I know that I have access to a gym in my apartment, and I know that it's really good for me, but I work out probably 2 times a week, and that's not such a great thing. Hopefully you guys do better. But this sort of, for the poor, what we argue in our paper, and what More Than Good Intentions really drives home, is that that irrational behaviors that we all have can really perpetuate or even deepen the effects of poverty. So this leads to, and I don't mean that to hyperbolize, if that's word. So this leads to our second consideration for the paper, what we refer to as the last mile problem to behavior change. By this we mean linking desire and ability through financial education and opportunity through access to financial services to corresponding behavior change, and in this case, savings. So to give you an example of what we mean, in our paper we present the example of M-Pesa. In 2010, M-Pesa partnered with Equity Bank in Kenya to offer customers an interest-bearing savings account on their cell phone, M-Show. M-Pesa has over 20,000 vendors that allow deposits into this account, and as you might imagine, the take-up of the account was pretty impressive, about 500,000 in just 3 months. But in our paper, we address how the sign-up for the accounts signals intent to save, but over half of these accounts remain unused. About 38% of those signing up for the MK-Show account actually used it. So we know that there are psychological barriers to behavior change, but very little work, to our knowledge, has been done to explore the nexus between savings and habit formation. So we highlight in our paper 3 major psychological biases, and it's not by any means exhaustive of the psychological barriers that can prevent savings habit formation. But the 3 are availability bias, status quo bias, and hyperbolic discounting. So I'll briefly describe what I mean by those. So when applied to the context of decision-making, availability bias is a tendency for people to make choices based on sort of the frequency of information that comes to mind. So for example, a person may choose to save under their mattress because in their memory, they've seen family members or community members or people close to them saving under a mattress. And that's what comes to mind, and that's what sort of informs or can inform or guide their decision-making towards saving in a mattress as opposed to saving in a bank. The second is status quo bias, and this is a tendency for people to remain with their current situation. It's what Richard Thaler and Karlan Sunstein in their book refer to as the heuristic. And here, a person who saves their money under a mattress just may see no reason to alter their status quo. And finally, the third bias that we highlight is hyperbolic discounting, which is what Dean mentioned earlier, and it's this inclination towards sort of larger, later rewards over smaller, sooner rewards. So for a young person, they may intend or hope to save for the future, for their education, but something more immediately gratifying and exciting catches their eye, and there goes the smaller, sooner reward. So here we've linked together these three components: financial capability and saving to long-term stability, the behavioral challenges to establishing sound financial behaviors, and psychological barriers to developing those behaviors. And so given these variables, these psychological variables that we feel are missing from the standard capability definition, we argue that in this case, low-income youth may need a push to choose to save. And that's what we refer to in our paper as nudges, or mechanisms that can guide certain decision-making. And this was made sort of popular and famous by Karlan Sunstein and Richard Thaler in their book Nudge, and you can find a comprehensive summary of this on page 9 of our paper. Just a little plug. So one of the nudges that we advocate for, and I'll just give a quick example before I turn it over, are commitments and peer pressure around a particular action to help overcome this hyperbolic discounting challenge that I just mentioned. So one particularly striking example that's actually also highlighted in More Than Good Intentions is a commitment savings devices, or seed accounts, save, earn, enjoy, deposits, designed by Nava Ashraf, Dean Karlan, and Wesley Yin. So 2 commitment devices were offered to existing customers of a bank in the Philippines. Customers could either set an account below which they couldn't access that amount, so whatever it might be, $12, and they couldn't go below that. And the second was for customers to set a date before which they could not access their funds, so whatever it might be, May 12th, and they couldn't access it before that. So the actual funds were kept in a lockbox with the customer, and the bank held the key. So after 1 year, average savings balances had increased by about 81%, 82% for clients who signed up for the accounts relative to those in the control group. So it's pretty significant. And other commitment devices are also offered around the world, but we believe that these are relevant cues for providing youth savings commitment devices, which to my knowledge are not yet offered, but I could be wrong. And so in conclusion, I'd like to just emphasize that we believe that further research and experimentation on nudges aimed at increasing savings behaviors among low-income youth is still a necessary step to employing them effectively, as Dean and I'm sure many of you will agree. And so while we acknowledge that the goals of financial capability vary and are not necessarily solely restricted to savings, we think it's an important outcome of financial capability and deserves attention. So with that, I'd like to call up the panelists and our moderator, Jamie, so that we can hear their perspectives and reactions and discuss. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pyle. Obviously, a lot of information coming in, everyone, a lot to sift through here. I'm sure there are many questions and reactions among our panel to both Dean's presentation and to Pyle's, as well as among the audience. So our panel today, I think, represents a real diversity of thinkers and doers in and around this world of financial capability. And I'm sure they have no shortage of opinions and reactions that they would like to share. Before they get started, I'll introduce each of the panelists briefly, and then we'll just move straight into questions. One small bit of housekeeping that I usually remember but forgot this time is that all of our events are webcast live. So for the panelists and anybody in the audience who asks a question later, please do speak directly into the microphone. And the audience, please introduce yourself before you speak, for the enjoyment of everyone who is watching over webcast. If you're not speaking in the microphone, they can't hear you. So I will not introduce Dean again, but here he is, right to my right. Next to Dean is Ben Schell, who is a senior associate in new product development at Women's World Banking. He supports the network members and manages projects to develop adult and youth savings products, branchless banking options, financial education programs, and microinsurance across regions. His support spans the complete product development cycle from initial market research through piloting and rollout. And I see that you keep in your bio financial education, which is now the passé term for financial, just kidding, financial capability. This is another debate that we tend to have. To his right is Joshua Sledge, who is an analyst on the innovation and research team at the Center for Financial Services Innovation. In this position, he conducts research to monitor and analyze emerging trends and innovations in the financial services industry. And recently, his research efforts have been focused on the development of a financial capability framework, which I hope to hear more about, focused on helping consumers adopt behaviors that will lead to improvements in their financial health. And then at the end of the panel is Guy Stewart, who is just finishing up a 13-year stint as a lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School, where he taught courses on microfinance and management. He is transitioning into a role as senior advisor at Microfinance Opportunities, with whom he works on client-focused research and on the Financial Capability Index, I understand, which I hope we also hear more about, and is a fellow at the Ash Center at Kennedy School. So just to get us started, one thing that, and I think I'll sit, this term financial capability, and I've just always been really struck, it's kind of this new term, everybody's saying it, nobody seems to agree on what it really means. So there are a variety of definitions. Each of you work on kind of different aspects of it, from the on-the-ground research to product development through, spurring new innovations and ideas, to considering how it could be measured in a different context. So I'm wondering if we could just kick it off by telling the audience in just a few words really the nature of your work on financial capability. Dean, I feel like you kind of already said, if you want to say a few more words, maybe around some of the different projects that IPA has going on right now that aren't included in your book or that you didn't mention or you'd like to say more about, that would be fine. I'm just curious about everyone's personal or the institution's thinking framework approach to financial capability, and how, if how it might differ or not from what we've been talking about today in this role of behavioral economics. So we could just roll down the table and then pick it up from there. So please go ahead.
Okay. Well, is this on? I don't think so. Is this on? No.
This one's on.
Are you sure?
Here.
Okay, you try this one.
Okay.
Is this one working? Yeah.
So financial capabilities. You're right. I've never thought too hard about how to define it because I think more about the things that I've always seen thrown under it, and I couldn't agree more with the sentiment that it just seems to be kind of changing lingo to force fit the same old thing.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the nature of the beast when, frankly, there isn't really solid evaluations. So that's the thing that I've been struck by more than anything is that when labels get changed around and people keep trying different things but without having clear evidence on whether something is working or not, that's what happens when there aren't strong evaluations that really can help test things in a very careful, clean way. So that's my basic. Whenever I hear the changing lingo, I just kind of tune out and move on to like the nuts and bolts of okay, let's just get down to what the actual program is doing and let's figure out what the themes here are in terms of the way they're designed, what problems, what market failures, what personal failures they're trying to address, and whether they're actually achieving those goals or not. Having said that, if I were to define it, I would just say that it's a suite of financial services that are being offered to individuals that are appropriate for the needs that they have, and that they're presented in a way that are likely to get used in the way that they're intended. So that includes something that kind of resembles financial education, but what I'm doing in that definition is intermingling education with the product, in the sense that if the product is something that nudges, to go with our favorite word of the day, people to the right decision, I don't really care whether they're educated about it or not, as long as they're using the service the way that if they were educated and really could like work out the Excel spreadsheet on their life and how they should be doing things, if they're behaving as if they're educated, then who cares whether they can solve the math and tell me how to compound interest rates. And there might be some situations where actually teaching lessons and having them have certain knowledge can help too. But that's the ultimate question, which one of the themes to which we're trying to tackle right now is how much behavior can one change merely through education versus education mixed in with products, and is it one of these cases where 1 + 1 is 3?
So I think the way you've described it, and I even think that the way a lot of people have been describing financial capability in the last few months or however long it takes to change, is pretty good and pretty accurate. I think what we're not sort of getting right yet is what kinds of education or marketing or whatever influence you're trying to have over people, what kinds of influence actually make the difference. So I think when we think, maybe the problem is when we think financial capability and we say education plus opportunity with products or opportunities to save, we think sort of a more traditional model about what is financial education or what is going to influence people to change their attitude or to change their or to gain new skills. And it's not. I don't think it's always going to be a traditional classroom-based model. And I think that's where we see a lot of innovation come in. And Women's Role Banking has been doing a couple of projects for almost 3 years now that combine financial education and savings accounts for youth, specifically for girls. And so we have a classroom-based model that we designed 3 years ago, and we haven't been able to do a rigorous evaluation on exactly what is changing in terms of what are youth doing sort of beyond the savings account. But we have seen that, unfortunately, for us and for the outcomes we're trying to reach, that financial education, even when it embeds a savings account, an attractively designed savings account in it, is not enough just to cause these youth to open accounts and to start using them. So there's potentially issues around the channels through which the product are available for use for the youth. Maybe it's not super convenient for them to deposit and withdraw all the time, but that's I think that's where we see a lot of room for innovation and a lot of potential for innovation. And we're also focused on adults, where Women's World Bank is now doing a project with a social communications campaign, which combines a social soap opera with financial education embedded in it, a marketing campaign that's linked with that's linked to a bank that's offering accounts, and financial sort of education discussion opportunities in communities with adults. And this is with adults, not with youth. But I think when you see a more holistic approach taken that's not just about giving people skills and teaching them in sort of a traditional setting, then you have more room for potentially changing, causing them to change their behavior. And I agree with what you said, Dean, before about how there's a lack of evidence around youth savings. There's some big claims being made now about what that's going to accomplish. If we just give the product, then people's lives are going to change. No, that's not true. And I think even if you do assessments, very rigorous assessments around simply offering a product, you're not going to see a lot of change. I think where you could see change is when you're addressing a lot of other issues in concert and in a coordinated way with the offering of the savings account and the opportunity for youth to start saving and for their parents to start saving for their future. So I think the definition of financial capability and the way we're thinking about it is not off. I think we just need to get the pieces right, like you were saying, sort of get the nitty-gritty right, and then we'll be okay.
Yeah, so we at CFSI, I think what we were saying about evidence and evaluation, really, that question really sparked our interest in this idea of financial capability. Essentially, we started doing some research about a year and a half ago into the financial education space, saying what works, what do we know works, what types of programs and interventions have been shown to be effective in changing people's behaviors. And in our first pass, we didn't see a lot. So we kind of extended our range of examination to talk to people at different programs who were creating these more holistic access plus education plus just overall support, social support. I mean, these much more holistic approaches and programs to see what about them were effective in creating behavior change. And even there, we saw some evidence of that, but not as much as we'd like. So what we did is identified some of the potentially promising strategies that we identified and tried to come up with a framework that essentially said, what is it that we mean when we're talking about financial capability, and how do we go about pushing the field forward towards these kind of solutions. So the way we always really look at it is financial education really focuses on what you know. It's really trying to improve your financial knowledge, whereas financial capability we really think of as it's what you actually do. So we define financial capability as a set of behaviors that consumers can adopt in order to improve their financial health, one of those which is planning ahead and saving for the future. So implementing the financial capability approach for us means offering tools, programs, a whole variety of implements, different approaches that can be used to help people to execute those behaviors, to help them adopt those behaviors. So one way I always talk about it is it's really extending beyond the classroom to what can we do to help people in their day-to-day lives to exercise those behaviors or make the decisions that are ultimately going to be in their best interest for their financial health. So right now, I mean, we really see some promising innovations in that area, and we hope to see more. We actually recently launched a fund, the Financial Capability Innovation Fund, where we provided seed funding to 5 organizations that are putting some of these innovative financial capability programs in place that combine access, education, a lot of these types of nudges and behavioral mechanisms as well. And what we're trying to do is not only just provide them with the funding to get them up and running, but also evaluate them rigorously. We're working with a set of evaluators, including Innovations for Poverty Action, to try to make sure that we think these are good interventions from what we've seen. They're very promising, but we need to know if they actually work and to what degree they do. So we're hoping that by doing this, we're not only help to create some good programs and create some interventions that are effective, but also be able to take the learnings from those and share them with the field and help to direct the resources and attention towards those types of strategies that are proven to be the most effective.
So let me answer, am I on? Yeah. So let me answer Jamie's question with a question to the audience. Do you feel financially capable?
We got a yes up front.
We got a yes up front. I don't want to get everyone to. We don't want to turn this into Oprah and have tears. But the reason I asked is because as you thought about answering the question, you probably thought about some factors, some criteria that you use, some concepts that you use to define what it means to be capable. And they're likely to be concepts, ideas, criteria that are probably fairly common in the room to some extent, although we live in an income, racially, ethnically segregated society. There are some commonalities across the country. But your capabilities are defined by, and this goes back to the original concept of capabilities from Sen, is defined by what it means to be able to act within the society in which you live. And so when we're thinking about financial capabilities, we need to think about what does it take to manage your money well in the context in which you live your everyday lives. Manage your money well for cash flow purposes, for risk management purposes, for long-term asset accumulation. Those are, by the way, those three concepts are fairly, I've applied them as if they're universal concepts. In some ways, I think they are, but even those might be subject to dispute. For example, what does it mean to accumulate assets in one context versus another? So that's where I begin when I think about financial capabilities, is what does it take to be a good money manager, an economic agent who manages their finances well within the context in which you live. And so what we do in our research, Microfinance Opportunities and I do in our research, is we go into communities and we do a modified participatory ranking exercises where and some of you may be familiar with the wealth ranking exercises where members of the community rank households by income and wealth, and you essentially get a description of the households within the community based on the community's own knowledge about the assets and incomes of the members of the community. Well, what we do is we go in and do a ranking exercise, but not around wealth and income, but around financial capability and the ability to manage your money well. And we basically force people, we have a set of households that people can discuss, they're real households in the community that they know about, and then they rank them. In the process of ranking them, they have to explain why they've ranked them in a particular way. And from that, we get the community's own definitions of what it means to be financially capable. And for example, in Malawi, food security is a big issue. Okay, so people who don't run short of food during the hungry season are people who are considered to be financially capable, because in Malawi people run short of food. We're doing some similar stuff in Uganda. Food security did not come up. Those of you who've been to Uganda know that there's a lot of food around, and it literally doesn't come up as an issue. In the Malawi study, budgeting with your spouse came up as an example. Not budgeting generally, but talking to your spouse about budgeting came up as something that defines someone as financially capable. And so I'm not giving an answer to the definition, but I'm giving a way. There is some general answer, which is it's what it takes to manage your money well in the context in which you live. But what actually constitutes that varies from community to community, country to country.
Thanks, Guy. Yeah, and as you're saying that, it's reminding me of part of Dean's presentation where, he's asking and reflecting on, are we asking the right questions? Are we looking at the right interventions? And it sounds like that's the approach that you're taking, thinking a little bit more about Dean's presentation. And he focused a lot of it on this kind of topic of savings and youth savings, challenging some of our thinking and our own operations and activities, and also the often a lot of hyperbole around the savings field, and particularly the youth savings field. And I saw all of you writing notes as he spoke, and I'm sure you have some opinions. I wanted to give everyone an opportunity before we dive more deeply into this, talking about the paper, a chance to reflect on Dean's presentation, ask him any questions that you had, and give Dean a chance to react. So we could start this time at the other end, Guy, and then Dean can react at the end.
Just a couple of points, and one is actually builds on what I just said, which was the whole question about is it appropriate, for example, to encourage youth to save, given the life cycle hypothesis where people are supposed to be borrowing when they're young and then save up as they generate some income for themselves, pay down their debt, save up, and then dissave. That original hypothesis from the sort of standard neoclassical economics assumes a working capital market. So the first thing we need to do when we think about what we should be encouraging is to understand the capital market in which the youth are operating. Just focusing on this point. There are lots of other things we should be thinking about, but I'll leave that for later comments. And that means not just the formal capital markets, but the informal capital markets. So when we think about what we want to nudge youth to do, we need to think about, well, what are the resources they have available to them? Do they have an uncle that is going to step in and support their secondary schooling because they really want to go on to secondary schooling? Or is there a local money lender who sees in certain youth some prospects and thinks that they can get a piece of those prospects by making loans to that person and have them essentially indebted to them and paying off loans in the future? So we really, again, going back to this idea, we've got to understand the context in which people live. So a very immediate response to that life cycle hypothesis is it a working capital market? The other, what is the working capital market? The other thing to keep in mind is that there is a certain soundness to the idea that you first pay off debt and then you start to save. But I would guess at least most of the homeowners in this room have both savings and debt. And savings, because you have a mortgage and you also have savings in your bank account. And that's certainly true for me. I don't think I'm giving anything away. And the reason, one key reason for that is liquidity, is that, granted, mortgages are low, interest rates are very low right now, so it's a very easy thing to do. But I bet even when they were, 5, 6, 7%, you would go into most homeowner situations and they would be, if they saved at all, which is a problem in this country, but if they saved at all, they would have the debt and save. And the liquidity issue is very important. It keeps your options open. It gives you some ability to be capable within the context in which you're living. You can deal with sudden emergencies. You can deal with you can make changes in your life. You can take certain risks. So there are reasons why you might want to have both savings and borrowing. And I think Dean kind of alluded to it with mention of the emergencies issue. So that was the second. So just sort of building on his points, I wanted to sort of flesh that out a bit. The other thing that got me thinking was nudges for good versus nudges for bad. You are, again, looking at the context in which people are living. they're exposed to all sorts of prompts to do certain things. And if you want to be in the nudge business, you need to know what you're up against. You also, again, starting from where people are at, why not work out what are the bad nudges that work and see if you can work out how you could turn them into good, or how you can model your good nudges on the bad. Haven't thought much beyond that, but that was a second thing that was prompted by Dean's comments. I have a lot of others. I actually did write a blog review of Dean's book that on the Center for Financial Inclusion website that Beth Ryan runs. So there's more extensive comments there if you want to look there.
Yeah, one thing I was struck by in Dean's comments as well as in the book, and it's the focus on evaluation and creating effective evaluations that are really going to help us to isolate the variables in the programs we're creating that really work. And this is something that we are full-scale proponents of. I mean, in particular, we really see the financial capability field as we define it, and as we see it, as something that's developing and emerging. And as it develops and emerges, it's important that we are really able to identify early on what works and what doesn't. For me, I always question, though, the challenges. We always see challenges, and particularly with the randomized control trial evaluation method, and actually getting it implemented in organizations that we see doing interesting things. During the process, when we were getting applications from organizations from across the country, we kind of asked for their evaluation plans and worked to kind of work with them to see what they could do, what they'd be willing to do, how they could design it. And we were struck by a few things. I think, first off, people don't know how to run. They don't know how to do these. They don't know how to set them up in ways that you can really eliminate the biases that you're looking to eliminate. So they need help in doing that. And again, we were very fortunate to get the likes of Innovations for Poverty Action to help them work through that process. But when they don't, I think that's why oftentimes we see people settling for the before and after evaluation methods as a means of measuring impact. Secondly, a lot of times with the randomized control trials, we saw pushback in telling some people no. Essentially to remove the selection bias, you have to get everybody who comes in, have them take the step forward to say, we would like help. And then to get your control group, of that group, tell some people either no or waitlist them for 6 months and monitor their progress versus those of the people who did receive treatment. A lot of organizations push back at that idea. They're hardwired to believe anyone who walks in my door, I need to help them as much as I possibly can. So those were the challenges we've seen. I think the question really is, how do we get past those challenges? What can we do to help facilitate and provide the aid and support that some of those organizations need to really get at an effective evaluation? Because a lot of them are doing some really interesting things. And we'd really like to know exactly what it is about those interesting things that really works, so we can let the rest of the field know. So it's just, I'd love to get, Dean, your thoughts about how to support those organizations, what we can do to help facilitate more of the randomized control trials.
My question would be around how can we use randomized control trials and other evaluatory techniques to measure the kinds of programs that we think possibly could be most effective, which are the kinds of programs that I alluded to earlier, where you're interacting with people and influencing them on many different levels and trying to get at some of the really fundamental issues that they and their families and their cultures have that are holding them back from sort of optimal money management. Women's World Banking has done a lot of research around the world with women and their husbands and men and now with girls and boys and their parents as well. And we see that the ability to manage money effectively and to save money, it's not just about necessarily time management or about being too busy and forgetting or living too far away from a bank branch. It's so much about cultural issues and issues of identity and social roles that men and women especially play, and that really hinder them from as a family unit, often being able to manage money effectively. So in a lot of cultures, women are expected to manage the household budget, and they're given they have money which they can make from a micro business or a small business that they have, but the husband also gives them some money, but then he doesn't give them most of the money or a lot of the money, and so he just keeps some of it for himself for his own purposes, whatever that may be, and they don't communicate about that. The wife doesn't tell the husband about the money she's making because then he'll reduce his contribution. And the husband doesn't tell the wife how much money he's making because he doesn't want her to know how much he's keeping for whatever he wants to do on the side. So there's not a lot of communication. There's a lot of pressure to spend money on certain things, to look good, to buy the latest sneakers or get your hair done every week or whatever it is. There's so many pressures on people to spend money. So, and designing programs to address this, which I alluded to earlier, was like a communications campaign, which is not only designed to get people to think about alternative ways which they could manage money, but even really get into cultural change in terms of what's acceptable, what does it mean to be a good wife or a good husband or a good mother or a good father, and get people to start having conversations and changing their behavior eventually. And how can evaluation help us illuminate that when what's going to make a big difference is not an isolated program here or program there or intervention here, but it's everything coordinated on the same people in a coordinated fashion.
I don't know if this one's working. No, I tried the other one. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, so these were all very useful and very fruitful questions. Let me see if I can do it justice. I tried taking notes to each. So I wrote down 3 notes, Guy, from what you said. One was life cycle hypothesis and how the answer to this depends intensely on capital markets, where there might be settings where the capital markets are not sufficient. And the point that I was taking away from this is, so if there's no, to use an example, if there's no debt market in which you can borrow to pay for your education, then savings is good. Yeah. Okay, but the point is, I think that's missing the point in some sense. You're pushing savings. You're pushing something. There is an equilibrium. That equilibrium is one in which there isn't savings, there isn't debt, and you're choosing one to push. And so if we're going to do an intervention and we're going to do something, then we need to think about what that first best is. Now, it could be that the answer is the first best is not possible. And this is what I meant by saying, okay, if that's the case, let's recognize that. Let's understand why is first best not possible. Let's go for second best. Maybe second best is saving, and let's do that. But let's at least have a rationale for why we're not trying the first best. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's really simple, and maybe it's easy, and it's called you cannot borrow for education. You can't make 10-year loans in rural settings in developing countries when you just can't do that. There's no student loan market in most developing countries the way there is in the United States, where I can take out a loan at the age of 18, and I can have that loan supersede bankruptcy, supersede everything. Right? The legal systems just aren't there. And so the answer could be as simple as that. But it's not to say, I don't think we should stop just by saying, well, let's just accept the debt markets as they are and so push savings. We have to say, no, actually, debt markets are not satisfying the need, and we can't solve that problem. Mm-hmm. Okay, then look to second best, but don't. Okay, yeah. So the second point about simultaneous and saving borrowing, I think we mostly agree about this. I think I would just say 2 caveats. I mean, I have a home equity loan, debt. And I save too, but I'm borrowing at 1.7%. Yeah. Okay, so I'm leveraging is what I'm doing. And I'm borrowing low and I'm saving high in expectation, hopefully. So in terms of liquidity, there we're just getting to scale. That's a question of just what proportion are we dealing with. Mm-hmm. So yes, there's always an argument to having some cash on hand, and if the debt is set up in a way that if you pay it down, you can't just immediately draw it back out again, then yes, that's an argument for having some liquidity. But most of the space in which we see people encouraging savings is actually not doing that. And it's asking people to save beyond the point of liquidity on a day-to-day basis. And so that's the issue. Mm-hmm. The ideal dream product is one in which you have an account at a bank. And notice I didn't say savings or debt account. You have an account at a bank, yes. Period. that account can have positive and negative balance. That's like the dream account that I would love to see banks offer people. This is the way, I don't know why, but my bank in Cambridge when I was in grad school worked this way, but no bank since has it done this way, where I just had a home equity line of credit, and that was my account. I could make deposits and withdrawals from that, and it just kept going, and if it ever went positive, it went positive, and then I earned interest. If it went negative, I paid, and it was just one account. So most banks, for some reason, don't do that, but this one little tiny bank called Wainwright Bank in Cambridge allows you to do that. So that's the ideal in terms of liquidity management. Here's an example of a nudge for bad, I think, that fits exactly what you're saying, that can be turned to good, is temptation. So how can we make savings a temptation good? Right? I'll tell you one failed idea, or I shouldn't say failed, but it was, Jamie, you might know this one. They were trying this, and my understanding is it still underworks, and they were still in the kind of the operational phase of trying to figure out how to just get it used more. But imagine at the checkout counter of any sort of store having little cards that allow you to save right there. So you bought your stuff, and then there's right there in that moment of temptation a little card getting you to save. And maybe it has something attached to it, like a lottery ticket, or it does something to make it even more enticing than just a swipe card. But imagine it is just that. It's just right at that moment of checkout. There's, Keep the Change, done by Bank of America, kind of hits that bill a little bit. Although I've always been a little bit concerned that actually lowers savings because it makes you check the box in your mental head that says you've saved, when in fact you really haven't much. But I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen any sort of evaluation of that. But that's one way of thinking about it, is how can we make savings be something that you do out of temptation? Yeah. Okay, so Josh, so there were 2 points you made, and I completely agree with one and not the other. So RCTs are hard in a lot of settings. They are not for everyone. That's I think the first thing to recognize is just that there's many situations we find ourselves in which our best advice is no, don't do this. Your setting is not right. You haven't figured out your intervention yet. You got to just figure that out. You're not the right size. So there's many reasons why that's the case. I would argue that we have too much evaluation done in this world. That then looks at situations they cannot establish causality, and so then says, well, let's still look at, and by evaluation I mean impact evaluation. I say, and that still then says, let's push forward and let's do before-after studies. When instead, what I would like to see is monitoring exercises to see, did the organization do the things they said they were going to do? Did they deliver services? Operational research, are clients happy? Things of this nature. That's something we need. But don't sit there and try to tell me whether the education program increased test scores when you don't have any way of knowing what would have happened if the education program didn't happen. Instead, did savings balances go up? Instead, let's just look at usage. Did the tests, you're delivering textbooks, did textbooks go into schools? Let's look at these process outcomes. So I think there's a lot of situations where you're absolutely right, and it's not a good setting for RCTs. It could be a personality issue. It could be an operational issue. By personality, I mean, some people just don't like them. The best thing to do is knowing when to walk. Alex Kobushin, who's here, that's officially her job at Innovations for Poverty Action. She's somewhere here. Where are you? There you are. Hello. That's her job, is to help us figure out when to walk and when not, and when it's a beautiful setting. The second is it's hard to tell people no. So this is one of the a common thing that's said about randomized trials, but in most settings we're in, you don't have to tell people no. And or you don't have to tell people no any more than you would have otherwise. And there's 2 different scenarios that I'm talking about here. So in one setting, a randomized trial is simply accepting the organizational constraints that they naturally have. They have the ability to deliver training to 1,000 people. That's how many seats are in the room. That's how many trainers they have. They cannot train more than 10 at once. Whatever the constraint is, we accept it. It is what it is. And so in that setting, nobody is being denied a service strictly for research purposes. They're being denied a service because the organization can only deliver service to that many people. How that choice is made is done through a random process. But the right answer to them as to why someone is not receiving a service is because we have the ability to deliver service to 1,000 people. That's it. End of story. The second is that there's a lot of situations we do research where there is no denial whatsoever, where what we're doing is, and it's referred to, the technical jargon would be an encouragement design, but it would consist, for instance, of sending out marketing material taking a sample frame of 10,000 people and sending marketing material to 5,000, offering them a service. And the other 5,000 do not receive the marketing material. But if they come in and they ask for it, they can get it. There's no restraints whatsoever. And the experimental design is just is exploiting the fact that that marketing material will drive up usage, and that's sufficient for then estimating impacts. So that's another setting that another type of design we usually do when, for organizational reasons, no one wants to look someone in the face and say, sorry, no. If it's opening a savings account and you're a bank and you don't want to ever turn someone down who walks in your bank, that's perfectly fine. So again, those are ones where, depending on the setting, that's where different types of creativity and knowing how to do the randomized trials comes into play. But this does go back to your first point, that it makes it hard. I mean, I've definitely seen studies like that would make me cringe. That like no. Yes, it was done randomly, but there was some issue with how it was done that does create a problem. Ben, so I think there's one thing which I said, which I think your comment was mostly about how there's a few things at play here, and I think there's two main takeaways that I had. Was understanding that a lot of the interventions we talk about are going to be very culture specific. In particular, the examples you were giving are very ones that I personally have thought a lot about how gender roles will influence whether something works or not in a particular setting. And there's two basic thoughts that I had with what you're saying. One is that this is exactly why we need replication, and this is exactly one of the problems with academia. So if I do a study in the Philippines and I find a particular result, I have very little incentive to go and do that study in Nigeria, where the answer might be very different based on whether it's matriarchal or patriarchal, right? But yet, to get to the answer you want, we do need that type of replication, and we need to have some theory as to what is the underlying gender roles that is going to make this work, what are the underlying family dynamics, multi-generational issues that are going to make this work, and the ideal process is one in which we take a step back and we identify the key questions we have from theory as to why this is going to work, what are the cultural contexts, and we test across settings and we see, does this hold? Right? And that's what allows us to then go do 7 studies and then go to an 8th setting without the research and say, aha, we think we know we think we have an answer here. But that's not rewarded enough in academia. It's exactly one of the reasons why I started IPA, was recognizing that we needed an institution which would kind of carry forward with similar methodologies across settings. And I, as an academic, get very excited about doing the first, and I get very excited about seeing 7 done. I don't get very excited at doing the 4th and going and spending 4 months in the field to handle the 4th and the 5th. I, first of all, can't do it. There's a certain element of scale, and that's exactly what we're trying to build at IPA. And I think we have several settings where we have pulled that off, but we're definitely in the learning phase of how to do that, I would say. The other issue that I would say, though, is scale. And this is something which, whenever I hear about a program that is deemed so particular to a setting, so much context specific, so culture specific, and requiring so much hands-on work, I get a little bit nervous that we're not passing the would we be better off handing out the cash instead test. And what I mean by that is if it costs us that much money to figure out what's optimal, and we're not going to learn that lesson anywhere else, I genuinely get worried that we need to search for those solutions which are going to apply to millions. It doesn't mean that it's going to be one size fit all, but if we can't at some point get to those generalizable lessons that are scalable, then I get nervous whether the research is the right thing we should be spending money on. And whether we should be spending more money just handing out cash because there's no lesson that we're ever going to learn from something. Now, I don't think that's right. I think there are generalizable lessons that we can scale up. But I'm just saying, if I took your points to heart, it would make me and I really thought that was right, that we're just never going to get out of a particular context to have a generalizable lesson. I would start advocating myself that I should quit my job and others like me, and we should just start handing out cash.
Okay, well, with that, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I do have one last question I want to pose, and then open it up for, I guess, a round of questions, assuming there's a little bit of time left over. And my question's really coming back to this topic of youth savings and youth financial capability, and that in our paper, what we're really trying to argue is that that these psychological biases that prevent positive financial behaviors later on in life, if we can find ways to address those earlier, the better. And there are simple ways in which you can address these biases, and this is these nudges that that Payal talked a little bit about. But we mentioned in the paper reminders, commitments, peer pressure, defaults, automation, incentives. There's kind of a whole gamut of different ideas, and as we had said, most of them have not been tested. Or actually none of them have been tested in the field of youth savings. At least they haven't finished the test yet, and very few even in the field of savings and microfinance. And so I just wanted to get everyone's opinion really quickly on one intervention, one nudge that you would like to see tested that you think would be compelling in the field of youth financial services in particular. Or if you totally disagree and think that they don't need to be tested, you can say that too. Just explain why. Just to give you a couple options there. So if we could just have one idea each, and then we'll open it up to everyone for a few questions. Who wants to start? Ben?
Sure. So I just want to clarify a little bit. Just that I wasn't thinking. Sorry. Can I do that? I was thinking more like when you do an intervention that is fairly comprehensive and impacting people on so many different levels, how do you evaluate the success of that and what was successful in that? More than like, we need to be throwing all this money into one situation that we can't take anything from that anywhere else. So I didn't mean to say that the latter. I meant to say the former. So answering your question, Jamie, about what I'd like to see, I would like to see just that, what I just mentioned, which is something that tries to increase financial capability and nudge and do all these things which we hope influence youth to become better money managers through a wide variety of coordinated mechanisms. One which is more trying to make one which is really focused on the external and sort of cultural issues and making it cool, making it interesting, making it inspiring, and making it sort of a movement. And then another coordinated with opportunities for people, for individuals, for boys and girls themselves to learn, to increase their own internal capabilities and attitudes about using formal financial services, and then also offering products, having financial institutions offer products which are appropriate and attractive for youth, and hopefully the regulatory framework is conducive in there as well. So addressing a lot of what you talk about in here as the external challenges, which is at the end of the paper, but then also the internal challenges, and seeing a program that, or a project or a movement that does that in a coordinated fashion in a particular market. I think that would be expensive, but potentially very, very, have a lot of impact.
So to play devil's advocate, or to take a slightly different approach to the whole nudge issue. So let me start by actually answering your question, Jamie. So I'd like to see a nudge that prompts youth to organize politically, to demand reform of the governments of their countries so that they root out corruption and provide the services they're supposed to provide in an efficient and effective manner so that the youth can actually get a decent education and get a job where they're not subject to the inefficiencies and inadequacies of the society. Why? Now, that's really a non... I haven't really answered it in the spirit of the paper, but there is a. I mean, I actually do mean that quite seriously. But there is an important point which is very specific to the paper, which is, I like the fact that behavioral economics has gotten economics to be real, because economics, for so many years, you couldn't engage economics because they were dealing in a fantasy world. And Dean's got a lot of credit for bringing reality. He does these field tests, he does this work, and it's fantastic. There is a whole part of academic world which has been looking at markets and societies for many, many years in reality, on the ground. And there's been a lot of theoretical development which can now engage behavioral economics. And the field that I work in is economic sociology, where we look at networks of relations. Networks were mentioned in this paper. But I would want to see, before you do any nudge work, I want to see a much better sort of working out of network theory, and there's a whole ton of literature on that. There's also the sociological version of institutionalism, where institutions are defined as repeated practices, whether formal or informal. They're not the institutions of economics, which are more about rules and laws and things like that. And it really speaks to culture and how people get embedded in certain mindsets. Their cognitive frameworks are set by their parents, their society, etc. And how, if you're going to do nudging, you have to take that into account to understand that. And a third element of this is the spatial element, the organization of space and the representation of bodies and physical objects in space, and how that is both a manifestation of the culture in which you're in, but also affects behavior, etc. And so, going back to my original point, is there are socio-structural variables at play, and you may not want, if you're nudging, you may want to think about nudging within those socio-structural variables and how those nudges get mediated, or you may want to think about nudging to change those socio-structural variables, because they can be changed. We are not cultural automatons. We are not simply victims of our society. There is agency in all of this. So that's where I'd like you guys to go with this. Is you started with the economics. Let's bring in the other fields and have a real engagement around the data and around what helps us to understand. And this is final important point. Is theory helps us gives us a first cut at understanding what's going on. Going back to Dean's first point about the small studies, is understanding the causal mechanics, what's actually going on in the lives of these people that makes them do certain things. Theory helps you at least give you a beginning on that. And there's a lot of good theory out there, and we should exploit it so that we can use that to turn it into practice, very real practice that helps low-income people around the world.
I like commitments. They're pretty cool. No, but actually, I think that of the nudges listed here, I think that's one area where I'm really excited to see more, particularly in the area of youth savings, the kind of the commitment and peer pressure. I think, in particular for youth, there's an obvious institution to do it within, which is the schools. I think the bank at school programs are great. I feel like they're starting to kind of make a comeback. And I think a big reason there is, one, at that age, those kind of impressions about what your peers are doing, what they're involved in, I think can have a really big impact on what you also do. You kind of tend, when you're 13 years old, you don't want to stand out. You follow the crowd. So if the crowd's saving, great. But also, I think it's good to get youth that first experience with financial institutions. We think those first encounters, we call them, with the financial system can be so important. And if they are made on their own and they go south, we think that's what contributes to the large un- and underbanked population we see. People have experiences, particularly before the overdraft regulations were changed, where after a month of using a checking account, they've got a negative $400 balance, they're kicked out, they're done. So if you can get a positive relationship, a positive first encounter with the financial services industry within the school, within a familiar institution, along with your peers, hopefully that will stay with youth and not only encourage the habit of savings, but also encourage the habit of maintaining that relationship with a financial services provider that really meets their needs.
Okay, Dean, final word.
Sure. So 2 quick thoughts on preceding things. First of all, I agree with what you're saying, Ben. And I think this is one of those areas this goes back to not the answer to this question, but I'll just say this briefly, that one of the things that we don't see enough of in the space of evaluation is we see too much kind of A versus nothing. Whereas a lot of the interesting questions that I think are going to help us in terms of learning greater lessons are about getting into the components. And so it is about, is 1 + 1 equal to 3? And we're going to get that by designing studies which do include more than just one thing at a time. But those are harder to do. You need larger sample sizes. You need, kind of willing partners and things like that. And so it's easy to say this up here at a podium. Oh yeah, you just need to do A times B times C times D. But then let's get into the field and actually get through the nuts and bolts and get it through a committee of 10 people who all have to sign off. And then sometimes it's harder. So you don't see as much of that type of research as I would certainly like to see in the world. So I like. I was going to say what Josh said, so I'll skip that, other than to say I agree with Josh. And I'll throw out two nudges that I'm kind of working. Three nudges, one of which I'm working on, and two of which I want to work on. One is called Bolt. It's plagiarized from Dick Thaler, who started Save More Tomorrow with Shlomi Bernartzi. Bolt is Borrow Less Tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And its inspiration is exactly the same. And it's about, and it goes back to this issue of okay, if this is someone who is in debt, which is high interest rates and their optimal thing, given all these other issues that we just discussed, conditional on those being kind of satisfied, what is the right mechanism for getting someone out of debt faster? So we're trying something in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for instance, that is very similar to a website I started called Stick, where people give the email address or the phone number of their mother. And they form a debt plan, as in to get out of debt faster than they otherwise would. And we pull their credit reports, and if they don't satisfy what they said they would do, we call their mommy on them. So it's a simple commitment device to borrow less tomorrow. And there's other ways you can think. There's different ways that it could manifest itself with just changing the status quo, the whatever plan. So that's one that we're trying out different methods for. The other two, which I want to work on, one is very simple, and it is a delayed withdrawal. It was actually, when we started off the commitment savings account in the Philippines, it's actually where we went to the field to test. We went there, we did focus groups, and everyone laughed at us. The idea was simple, which was that you have a savings account, and that in order to withdraw your money, you have to go in, fill out a form, or just ask for it, and then come back 2 days later and get your money. And the idea was that this was supposed to then, help people resist temptation withdrawals that were not necessary. Like I said, this did not pass the qualitative first test, the sniff test. Everyone just laughed at us, and they said there were two deep flaws with this when we brought it to potential clients. One was that just the physical travel costs were too high. It's like, no, what are you talking about? It takes me 2 hours to get to the bank. I'm not going to do that twice. That's crazy. And the second was, that smells like incompetence to me. And it was, it was too similar to an experience that you would get with a bad institution, where you go and then you're told, oh, come back. And so for both of those reasons, we immediately started, going to Plan B, Plan C, Plan D, and what was discussed earlier by All was Plan B or C or D, I don't remember which. But in this day and age with mobile banking, it's back on the table. And so we're now looking for a partner to do this, where you just send a text message, you don't have to go to the bank, saying, I want my money, make it available in 2 days. And so we're looking for places to do something like that. The other one gets at the simultaneous savings and borrowing question again. So there's one reason why people often engage in simultaneous saving and borrowing, and it's driven by mental accounting. It's driven by the desire to have savings for the sake of savings, even if it's not financially smart. And there's a second reason for it, which is having debt is a commitment device to save. What do I mean by that is simple. If you have debt, you have to repay it. Paying down debt is savings. That is what that is doing. It's paying down debt, but it's a savings payment. It's a savings payment which lowers your debt level. And so the argument goes that sometimes people take out loans simply to have a commitment device to save. But that's a really expensive commitment device. So here would be my ideal, is a bank that tells people they're in debt or tells people they're more indebted than they really are. Okay, so tell someone who has tell someone they have $200 in savings and $1,000 in debt, when instead they really just have $800 in debt and no savings. So it's all about the way we present their financial portfolio to them. And if we present their financial portfolio by partitioning off parts of their debt to be savings, to give them that illusion that they've saved up, when in fact all that we're really done is give them more wiggle room to borrow in the case that that savings is needed. So you give them an education account, but there's not actual money sitting there. What it really is part of their line of credit allows them to draw down when they need it. But it's much more profitable for the client. And the extra interest that they earn from doing that can lead to much higher long-term consumption because of all the interest they're not spending. The trick is, how do you get a bank to do this? It's easy to get individuals to do it. Clearly better off for them. The trick is the bank side. So a bank loves the idea of having someone deposit $1,000 with them and lend to them at $1,000 when the lending rate is much higher than the savings rate at the interest. That's very profitable for banks. So the question is twofold. One is it profitable for one bank to do this all on their own balance sheet? And that might be, the answer very well may be yes. It very well may be that the long-term health of the client wins out, and that the bank management is the one that's being hyperbolic here by kind of gluing on to that, really holding on to that short-term profit of the money pump of lending to the same person who's borrowing from you, and not doing what you need to for the long-term health of that client to keep them as a long-term healthy client of your bank. The second is that it might actually just be that it's not profitable for the bank to do it, but that there's third-party intermediaries that can do this effectively and can manage the process. So it's much easier to think about this in the internet space, where you would have a portfolio presenter, a portfolio manager who manages your household finance, and you pay them and they pay debt. And so they can present to you your portfolio, and they can basically be consolidating all of your assets and liabilities in the way it's presented to you. So these are things that we're looking into, both in the developing country setting, which obviously is not going to be using the internet, but doing other mechanisms for doing this, and we're also looking at this in the United States.
Thanks, Dean. Yeah, that would be it'd be interesting if we had time, which we don't, but to explore how you would vary those types of interventions for youth-specific contexts. But unfortunately, I don't feel like we allotted enough time for this event, and we are over time. And I really hate ever closing down an event without taking questions from the audience. But I also don't want to hold everyone hostage here either. So we can take a round, or I could just close it down right now and everyone can stick around and ask some questions. Can I get a show of hands of who wanted to ask questions? Okay, so let's just take two, and if you need to go, please. Though I will say that Dean is sticking around after the event to sign books. So if you do want to grab More Than Good Intentions and have a signature from Dean, you'll want to stick around just a couple more minutes. So let's just take two. Let's go just in the middle here, Anjana, here in the blue shirt. Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name is Lauren, and I work with the Department of Health and Human Services. And what we do in the Administration for Children and Families is we do an evidence-based approach for anti-poverty programs for vulnerable youth. And I was just wondering what your guys' thoughts were on how behavioral economics and the idea of nudges can support vulnerable youth who are in transition from being youth to becoming young adults. Just like what your thoughts are on how we can support encouraging good financial behavior. So.
Okay, great. And then, Jenna, I think there was a question just to your right. Was that right? Yes, you? Yes?
Hi, Dudu Ins. I'm a graduate student at University of Southern California. Thank you for this lively discussion. I have maybe a very basic question, but well, financial capability is defined as the ability of managing your finances. I think it starts with the assumption that you have finances to manage. So, I mean, one of the troubles that we faced in microcredit was that, we started with those big assumptions that we could help the poorest of the poor. I do understand the importance of, saving behavior for anybody from coming any income group. But in terms of offering institutions micro savings services, is there like any limit to, how much we can go down, into the bottom of the pyramid? Or for the poorest of the poor, micro savings cannot be the best option maybe, and we need different interventions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry. I wish we could take more questions. We'll have to close it down there, and please stick around and ask questions afterwards. But who has reactions to which ones? I would open it up to, opinions on interventions for at the very bottom of the pyramid.
Sure, I can talk about the last one.
Sure.
Yeah, I think with we're working with a few microfinance banks on this exact question of can we offer savings accounts that are profitable or at least sustainable for institutions which need to be profitable. Can they do that for the very bottom of the pyramid? There's a lot of work around using agents and using very low-cost technology channels like mobile phones to lower the cost of delivering these services. And there's a lot of evidence that clients are willing to pay to have access to these services. So whereas more wealthy clients would want a positive interest rate on their account, lower income clients would be happy to have a negative real interest rate by paying for transactions and not even getting any interest at all on the account, just for the opportunity to put money in a safe place. And to make it useful to be able to send money to somebody else, or to pay bills, or to pay for goods or services. So I think the banks are still working on this model and perfecting it, but there is a lot of opportunity there. I don't know if we're going to be able to go as low as it's possible to go, but a lot lower than we are now. So as these technologies and business models get further developed, and we're working on this with banks throughout the world, we'll see a lot more of that.
I can just build on that. I also do a lot of work on financial diaries, where we track the inflows and outflows of money through people's hands. And the poorest, now there are people who are extremely poor who have no networks, have no connections to others. But those who do have connections to others, the thing that they need is a cheap way to get money from their family and friends and the people they're dependent on. Now, that's a first, you'd hope that they might move beyond dependency. But as a first step, that's important. So we just finished a study in Kenya on the use of M-Pesa, and 80% of the remittances through the network, and we're able to track the relationship between the people on each end of the M-Pesa. 80% of the remittances were between friends or within families, very highly relational, and it very much mirrored the whole sort of cash gift giving culture that is strong in Kenya, and we've also found the same thing in Malawi. A large flow of cash gifts between individuals. So there's a lot of people who are highly dependent on others. Now, it's not ideal, but at least if you can get services that get that money into their hands more cheaply, that's a good start.
So Josh and Dean, if you wouldn't mind taking a crack at the first question, which is about nudges or interventions for youth that are transitioning.
Sure.
If you can,
Well, the first thing I'll do is I'll give another plug for the New America's paper. I think they did a really good job of describing some interventions aimed at youth in particular for savings that really shows how these principles that we've been discussing can be applied to that population. Another thing I'd say is in particular from the financial capability framework, we look a lot at context, and particularly the context of relevance. What are the other institutions that are touching the child's life as they're making that transition? Is it a workforce development program? Maybe there's a way to attach something to a default savings account. Is there a budget counselor that they could provide or a credit counselor if they're looking to borrow for education purposes? So I really think it depends on the context of that particular youth, what they're going through during that transition, and trying to find ways, what are the financial challenges that they're going to face at that time, and thinking about the institutions that are touching them as they make that transition, and also just ways that you can support them in making that transition that still protects their financial health and helps them learn how to make better financial decision making is the right way to go. But it's going to be different for each child. It's going to be different for each situation, and that focus on relevance of context, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I concur. I was just going to add one thing, which is I think it helps to think about why are you posing the question about vulnerable versus youth? And I don't mean this as a bad thing. I'm just saying once you answer that question, and then it might illuminate some differences. So take peer savings as an example. If someone's a vulnerable youth, let's define that. Let's think about that in a kind of a negative way. Peer savings might not be such a great idea. Maybe you want to get them away from their peers. That's what we mean by vulnerable. Or maybe you want to choose their peers that they're supposed to be learning from. Whereas for a program that is dealing with youth that are not vulnerable, there you might want to think about an intervention which accepts the friends and accepts the networks as they are and works with them to help generate healthy financial habits. So, we have to think, you just have to think about what is it that's making them vulnerable and how might that change the answer to the question. Because in some settings it might not, in some settings it would, but...
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone, for sticking with us. Please, stick around, buy the book, grab the paper, ask some questions, and please join me in thanking Dean, Ben, Josh, and Guy for this really interesting panel. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
And Payal also.